Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Cars with Cuz. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to paint your brake calipers so you can go from this to this. As always, let's start off with everything you're going to need to paint your brake calipers. First off, a breaker bar, a socket set, and a small ratchet, so you can remove any nuts and bolts from the brake caliper and the tire. You also might need a hex bit set and a bit driver in order to remove the brake caliper guide pins to open up the caliper. And if those bolts are really rusted on there, you're gonna need some lubricant to remove them, such as WD-40. And to keep those hands nice and clean, I also recommend that you use some gloves. And if you're going to be removing your brake caliper, I recommend that you pick up a set of brake line pliers. This way you don't damage your brake line when you're removing your caliper from your car. But if you don't have any brake line pliers and you don't want to buy some, then you can also just use a 2x4, wedge it between your driver's seat and the brake pedal. Doing this will create enough pressure for the brake fluid to stay inside the brake line. And if you're going to be removing the brake caliper, make sure you also get some new brake fluid. You're also going to need a brake fluid bleeder. You can buy one or make one yourself. Either way, you're going to need this to bleed the brakes. And after you remove the brake caliper, I recommend getting some metal wire brushes to aid you in removing some of the rust off your brake calipers. Now, there are one of three ways to sand down the brake caliper to bare metal. The first one is just regular old sandpaper. You can do it by hand. The other two ways are first the DA. Basically, you just connect it to your compressor if you have one and put some sandpaper on it and use that. Or you can use an angle grinder and maybe a Dremel for the tight places. But either way, I'm going to be showing you all the methods that you can use to sand down your brake calipers. And after you've sanded down your brake calipers, you're going to need something to clean it. So just some regular old soapy water is going to work. You can also use brake cleaner or wax and grease remover. However, if you do use the wax and grease remover, make sure that's not the last product you use on the brake calipers before painting, as the wax and grease remover can cause the paint to bubble up. So instead, finish off cleaning your brake caliper with some soapy water so you can ensure a proper bond to the paint. You're also going to need some paper towels or some shop towels to dry off those brake calipers after cleaning them. And after you've done that, you're going to need some tape to mask off any areas that you don't want to get paint on. And speaking of paint, you're going to need some to paint your brake calipers. First up is a high heat primer so you can paint that exposed metal on the brake calipers. Up next is your color of choice to paint your brake calipers with. This also has to be high heat paint because those brake calipers can get really hot. And after you're done painting, just in case you get some overspray on something you didn't want painted, you can use nail polish remover or acetone to remove the paint. And when you go back to reinstall the calipers on your car, you're going to need some thread locker for those caliper bolts, so when you go to install them, any vibrations that the bolts might experience won't cause them to get loose. And since we are going to be removing the tires, you're also going to need a jack to jack up your car so you can take the tire off. You're also going to need something to choke off the wheels, so I just have these two pieces of wood to put in front of the tires so the car doesn't roll. And last but not least, you're also going to need some kind of drain pan to catch any brake fluid that comes out, or some brake cleaner that you use to clean the brake calipers off instead of making a huge mess. Oh, and I almost forgot. Since you are going to be painting and you are going to be sanding, please wear a respirator. You don't want any of those paint fumes or sand dust to get into your lungs. So be smart, be safe, and wear a respirator. Now, there are multiple different ways to paint your brake calipers. One of the ways to do it is to actually paint your brake calipers using a paintbrush and the color of your choice. Now, the way I did this is by simply poking a hole in the spray can, letting out all the gas and air from the spray can in a cardboard box, making sure it doesn't get on anything else. And then I poured the spray paint into a jar and then just used my paintbrush and began painting. The best part about this is you really don't have to mask off anything because you can really be precise about painting it. The downsides about doing it this way is you have to apply a lot more coats and you have to wait a really long time for the paint to dry. Another method to painting your brake calipers is just simply by leaving the brake calipers on the car, masking everything off that you don't want painted, and then sanding the brake caliper, applying the primer and the paint color of your choice. This is by far the easiest way to paint your brake calipers. However, in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to paint your brake calipers by removing them from your car. If you do remove your brake calipers from your car to paint them, remember, you will have to bleed your brakes. And if you don't know how to do that, there are plenty of tutorials on YouTube on how to bleed your brakes. So watch one before you take off the brake calipers to paint them. With that being said, let's get into this DIY video on how to paint your brake calipers. First off, let's take those two pieces of wood and choke off the rear wheels. There's one, and there's the other. You also have to remember to push down the parking brake or pull it up depending on the car you have before you jack up your car. And now that you know everything you're going to need to paint your brake calipers, let's start this video off by breaking these lug nuts loose. And now that you've broken loose the lug nuts, you can begin jacking up your car. Now you can just unscrew the lug nuts the rest of the way by hand. Now you can safely remove the tire, and after you've done that, take the tire and slide it underneath your car just in case the jack fails. Now take your drain pan and place it underneath your brake caliper, and then turn your steering wheel to the appropriate side so you have easier access to the brake caliper bolts. Now take some lubricant and spray down those two bolts so they're easier to remove. There's one, and there's the other. Now go ahead and break those two brake caliper bolts loose. First the top, and then the bottom. Now go ahead and loosen out those two bolts by hand. First the bottom, and then the top. Now if you have a brake pad sensor, use a 10mm bolt to break it loose and then unscrew it the rest of the way by hand. And now simply just unplug the brake pad sensor from the brake pad sensor pigtail. Now just take your brake line pliers, close them shut, and slide the retainer over to lock them in place. And now using the appropriately sized wrench, break the brake line loose. Now using both hands, carefully remove the caliper from the rotor. And now that you have the caliper off, begin turning it counterclockwise to unscrew the caliper from the brake line. Do not try unscrewing the brake line from the caliper. If you do it this way by turning the caliper instead of the brake line, you won't be damaging the brake line. Now that you have the brake caliper off, it's going to be a lot easier to sand and paint. So let's go disassemble the caliper. Really quick though, I just wanted to point out, I only took off the front two calipers. I did not take off the rear ones. The reason being, the rear calipers are the only brakes on your car right now. And if you take off all four calipers at the same time, you're not going to have any brakes. So I only took off the front two. After I paint them, I'm going to put them back on, and then I'll do the back two. I should also note that I went ahead and put the two tires back on, and that's because painting these calipers is going to take a while. And I don't want my car being supported by a jack for that long. It's now time to start disassembling the caliper. So get your caliper, your tools, and begin by removing the plastic cover for the guide pins. Get your tool and unscrew the guide pins from the caliper so you can open it up. I should also mention it's going to be a lot easier if you break loose these guide pins while the caliper is still on the rotor. Luckily for me, these weren't that hard to break loose. Now go ahead and remove the anti-rattle clip. And also remove the two brake pads. There's one, and the other one actually has clips that go inside the piston, so this one might be a little bit harder to remove, but this one was actually pretty easy. And don't forget to guide the brake wear sensor through the caliper. And there you have it. That's how easy it is to disassemble a brake caliper. You just remove the two guide pins, the anti-rattle clip, the brake pads, and then your brake calipers are disassembled. And now it's time to sand the caliper. And the first method I'm going to show you is using a DA and 120 grit sandpaper on my compressor. As you can see, using a DA is not really taking off a lot of that rust. This rust is really built on there from the brake line leaking. I guess the brake fluid got on the caliper, I'm not sure exactly. But this rust is not coming off, so let's try another method. This time I'm going to try using my Dremel with an 80 grit attachment. Let's see if the results are any better. Well, as you can see, the Dremel worked a lot better than the DA, and here are the finished results of sanding with the Dremel. And as for the other caliper, I tried using some metal wire brushes to try and remove some of the rust, but that didn't really work too well, so I ended up using an angle grinder, which worked amazingly on this caliper and helped remove a lot of the rust really quickly. And now that we finished sanding, we can get to the cleaning of the calipers, but first let's vacuum this table off and wipe it down. And now we can begin cleaning these brake calipers. Let's start off by trying to use some brake cleaner first. The brake cleaner worked okay to clean up these calipers, but now let's try using some wax and grease remover to get any of the remaining debris off this caliper before we paint it. Now remember to clean every single piece with the wax and grease remover, but do not let the wax and grease remover be the last product to use like I said in the beginning of the video. Instead, what you want to use is some soapy water and a paper towel or shop towel, and what you want to do here is to clean off those calipers until you can pick up your towel with no debris on it. That way you'll know the calipers are ready to be painted. So let me clean up these calipers real quick and then I'll get to the next step where you mask off everything you don't want painted on the calipers. Now I've gone ahead and masked off my table already because I don't want paint getting on this table, so let's go ahead and mask off the calipers as well. Now when masking your brake calipers, you want to make sure that you mask off any pistons or any rubber pieces or plastic pieces that may be a part of this caliper. You don't want to get paint on any of these components, so make sure you mask off the calipers properly. Now when you're done masking, it should look a little bit something like this, and that's okay if it doesn't. If you didn't mask off everything properly, you can still use acetone to remove some overspray off the components that you didn't want painted. With the sanding, cleaning, and masking completed, we can finally start applying paint. So let's apply our first light coat of primer, and remember, this primer has to be high heat primer because those brakes can get very hot. Now before you start spraying, make sure you shake the can up for about a minute. I already did it off camera, so let's start applying our first coat of primer. After applying the first coat of primer, remember to wait for about 10 to 15 minutes for the primer to dry. I already waited 15 minutes, so let's apply our second coat. And remember to shake the can before you start spraying. And when applying the second coat, you can go a little bit heavier with the paint. Now after you're done with your second coat and you let it dry for about 10 to 15 minutes, you can go ahead and apply your last coat of primer, making sure you get full coverage as this is your third and final coat. Now if you're painting your calipers like this, that means you just have to do the other side with primer too, and I already did that. This is the third and final coat of primer on the other side. So let's start painting with our first coat of paint, and remember to shake up the can really good for about a minute before you start painting, and spray on very light and even coats across the caliper, ensuring that you won't get any runs in your paint. Now I don't want to make you guys watch me apply every coat of paint, so this is the third and final coat of paint on the calipers. After this, I'm going to let the caliper dry for about 2 hours, and then I'm going to take the masking off. Now that I'm done taking the masking off, I'm going to let these calipers sit for about 24 hours before I put them back on the car, just so the paint can fully cure. But in the meantime, let's take a look at these calipers now that they're fully painted. And oh man, would you just check out how good these calipers came out. This took a lot of patience, but they came out looking great. And in case you forgot, this is what the calipers used to look like before, and this is what they look like now. Now reinstalling the brake caliper is just the reverse order, so just take your drain pan, place it underneath to catch any fluid, and then take your brake caliper bolts, put some thread locker on them to make sure these bolts won't come loose from any vibrations. And then take your brake caliper bracket, put it on the rotor, and hand tighten these two bolts on. First the top, and then the bottom. Now take the brake caliper itself and screw it back on the brake line in a clockwise motion. Remember, righty tighty, lefty loosey. Now rest the caliper on the rotor and then take your first brake pad, place it on the caliper, and then push the clips into the pistons. And then take your second brake pad, line it up on the caliper, and then take the caliper and place it on the rotor. Now take your anti-rattle clip and lock it into place on your brake caliper and the brake caliper bracket. Now take your brake caliper guide pins, place them in the brake caliper bracket, and guide them into the hole on the brake caliper. First the top, and then the bottom. Now hand tighten these down with the appropriate tool. Now take your brake pad pigtail and plug it back into the brake pad wear sensor. Then take the 10mm bolt and hand tighten it on first, and then screw it in the rest of the way. Now take the appropriately sized wrench and snug down the brake line bolt. You don't want to over tighten this as it could damage the threads, so just snug it down by hand. Now take the retainer clip off the brake line pliers, slide it down, and then remove the brake line pliers from the hose. Now using a breaker bar, tighten down the two brake caliper bracket bolts, first the top and then the bottom. Now using the appropriate tool, snug up the guide pins on the brake caliper, first the top and then the bottom. And in the final step, take your two guide pin plastic covers and put them back on the brake caliper. And with that done, you are officially finished reinstalling your brand new painted brake calipers. Now all that's left to do is to bleed your brakes, and I don't have a video on that yet. However, a massive shout out to ChrisFix, who is a huge inspiration to me, for letting me use his video on how to bleed your brakes. You guys can check out his video on how to do so by clicking the link in the description below. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, then make sure to hit that thumbs up button. And if you're new to my channel, then please consider subscribing. So until next time, I've been Cuz, you've been you, and I'll catch you later.